So we're going to start here on Daf Beis Amid Beis with Rava Omar. That's one line before the end of the Amud. And just by way of background, the Masechet begins with Beis HaShalchin. And Beis HaShalchin are irrigated fields. Like very often you have a field that's on a slope of a mountain and there's not enough rainwater, so you have to constantly irrigate it. Now, irrigating is a malacha which normally would be prohibited on Moed or on Shvius, except for the fact that here it's a davar ovid. It's something that if you don't take care of it, you could lose the productivity of the field. So therefore, the Mishnah paskins that for the sake of a davar avud, we were matir shvius as far as hashkah in a beis hashalchin. Now, there's a machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim about whether shvius bizman hazeh is doraisa or drabana. And Rebbe is of the opinion that shvius bizman hazeh is only drabana, and it makes sense therefore that the rabbana would be mekil in the case of a beis hashalchin for the sake of saving and preserving the crop. But according to the Chachamim, and this is what the Gemara assumed until Rava, who hold that shvius bizman hazeh is doraisa, then how could be lenient? The Torah prohibits it. Period. You can't find loopholes and bend over backwards because it's a beis hashalchin. Rava amar afilu temer rabbana. Rava says we could attribute our Mishnah, even according to the Rabbanan, who rejected Rebbe, they hold that Shvius Bizman hazeh is doraisa, and we could still justify the heter, the leniency of our Mishnah, of lahashkos beis hashalchin b'shvius. And what Rav is going to do now, he's going to change our very definition of malacha on Shvius, because on Shabbos we have a distinction between avos and toldos. Both are d'oraisa, both generate a chiyuv skila. But says Rava, with regard to Shvius, even though again Shvius is d'oraisa, even bizman hazeh, we're going according to the Chacham of Rebbe, avos asur achmana. In Shvius, the Torah only prohibited avos. Right, and here we start Daf Gimel. But toldos, lo asar achmana. Now, a good example of toldos Rashi gives us on the top is mashke mayim lizroim. So you've already planted your seeds, and now you are pouring water on the seeds, and that the purpose of which is to facilitate gidul, growth, and that is a tolda of Meleches Notea or Zorea. So there's planting when you put the seed in the ground, and then there's watering the seed once it's in the ground. That's a tolda, which is also on Shabbos. And again, it's the full brunt of the law. If you violate Shabbos with Mashke Zroim as a tolda of Zorea, you're chayav for that. But the Torah on Shvius did not prohibit toldos. Now, if that be the case, then with regard to irrigating a beis hashalchin, which is called mashke zroim, even in the worst case scenario that I assume like the Chacham that Shvius Bizman hazeh is doraisa, but it doesn't include the case of mashke zroim, because that's only a tolda, and the Torah never prohibited toldos. The Chachamim prohibited toldos, but they were flexible in the case of a beis hashalchin, and they were matir hashkah of a beis hashalchin. So you don't have to invoke the shita of Rebbe that Shvius as an entity is the Rabbanan today, and then say the Rabbanan are going to be making a beis hashalcha because of the hefsei, that financial loss that he'll suffer. Just simply say that Shvius as an enterprise is doraisa, is what I said, but not toldos. Toldos are only the Rabbanan, and mashke zroim is a tolda. How do the Chachamim know, according to Rava's drasha, as we'll see soon, that the Torah prohibited only av malachos in Shvius, not toldos? T'chsiv In the Parsha Shvius is in Bahar. It's at the end of Sefer Yikra Perek Chafei. Ubikshana Shvius, Shabbos Shabboson Yela Aretz Shabbos Lashem Sod Lo Tizra V'Karmecha Lo Tizmar Esfiach K'tzircha Lo Tiktzar Ves Invei Nizirecha Lo Tivtzar. Now, if we take a look at this pasuk, a careful look, the Torah prohibits Zmira. It says, Karmecha Lo Tizmar. And the best translation I can give you of Tizmar is pruning. Now, pruning is another example of causing growth, of increasing the productivity of something that's growing, which is a tolda of Zorea. So even though you didn't put the seeds in the ground, but unless you trim, again, you have to be a professional to know this, and the agricultural people will know when and how to trim a tree or anything that's growing. And that Zemira is actually a tolda of Zorea. And yet, the Torah says two things, Sodcha Lo Tizra and Karmecha Lo Tizmar. Why did the Torah feel compelled to add Lo Tizmar if that's just a tolda of Zorea? Michte Zmira B'chlal Zriya. Zmira itself is a subcategory of Zriya because through Zomer, you increase the productivity of the fruits. And that's exactly what Zorea is, to cause the Matzmiach, the Hatzmachas HaTruah. Not only that, but the Torah says, Lo Tiktzar, Esfiach Tzircha Lo Tiktzar, and then it says, Es Invei Nizirecha Lo Tivtzar. What's Betzira? Betzira is actually Ktsira. The only difference is that in Ktsira you cut off that which is growing, and in Betzira, what you do is you also remove something that's attached to the ground. So therefore the Gemara asks the same question again. Betzira b'chlal Ktsira. So Lamai Hilchos Kasvinu Rabbanu, why did the Torah have to mention Zmira and Betzira? Zmira is a told of Zriya, and Betzira is a told of Ktsira. And once you've told me that both Ktsira and Zriya are prohibited on Shvius, I know to derive the conclusion that Betzira and Zmira are prohibited as toldos. And the answer is, the Torah spelled this out to teach me, Lememra, Ahani told us Mechayev, Achrinaisa lo Mechayev, that the rule of thumb is that you're not chayev for toldos. These are only the two exceptions to the rule. Zomer and Botzer and Betzira and Zmira. These are the only two toldos which the Torah prohibited, but not because they told us, the Torah prohibited them explicitly. And the implication is that other toldos of other malachos were never prohibited by the Torah. Now, you could ask why, I don't know if this is a philosophical question of Taimei Dekra, but why would the Torah prohibit Zmira and Betzira, which are toldos, and yet all the other toldos are permitted, according to Rava? Rava is saying that these are the two exceptions because the Torah spelled them out. But the implication is all the other toldos were never prohibited by the Torah on Shvius. And the answer is because these malachos are domos b'tochnosam l'zrio ktsira yoser mishar malachos, meaning the gap between an av and a tolda is a great gap. We'll call it 50. But in these two cases, the gap is only 10 or 20. It's very similar to the original to av malach. So the Gemara now raises the following objection to Rava. For lo, are you telling me that other toldos beyond Bitsira and Zmira are not prohibited on Shvius? But Tanya, what are we going to do with the Brisa? The Brisa is darshaning the pasuk in the parish of Shvius. It says, "Ubeshana Shvius Shabbos Shabbos and Yel Aretz Shabbos Hashem Sadcha lo Tizra v'Karmacha lo Tizmar Ainli Ella Zerua Vizimur." This pasuk can only teach me two things that are asa b'shvius. One is Riyah in a field, and number two is Zimur in a kerem, because the Torah explicitly says Karmacha lo Tizma. So we're talking about a kerem, we're talking about a vineyard. Minayin, how do we know that the Torah prohibits on Shvius all the other toldos? For example, Nikush, Idur, Kisuach. Let's go through them. Nikush is weeding, when you take out the bad leaves and grass that are stifling the growth of the tzemach. Or Idur, when you dig underneath the vineyards in order to soften the karka around it. And Idur, by the way, is very similar to what we call Harisha. Now, there are certain places on the face of the earth, because of the topography, that you can't do Harisha, so instead you do Idur. B'makom she'ef shalachrosh b'machrecha, can go b'harim, or yesh sloim, so you can't go with the threshing material, with the plows. The plows just won't break through. So instead, what they do is chofrim b'dei adam imamader, and they dig with a shovel, and that's called idur, miloshen ma'ader. So the noun and the verb are very similar. And what you're doing is you're softening the karka by digging underneath the vineyard. What's kisuach? Kisuach is what we call grass cutting, mowing the lawn, right? So he cuts down the asavim roim, those bad grass that's stifling the growth of the good grass, the healthy grass. And he's not exactly doing menakej, because in menakej, he actually uproots it. Here he doesn't uproot it, he's just cutting it on top of the ground. But how do we know that even all of these malachas above, all of which are told, excuse me, are toldos of malachas oreh, how do we know they're prohibited on Shvius? Talmud Lomar, sadcha lo, karmacha lo. In other words, it should have said lo tizra sadcha. The verb comes before the noun. When the noun is the object of a verb, then the verb comes first and then the noun, which would be lo tizra sadcha. Don't do an act of zriya on your field. But here, the Torah says just the opposite. Instead of beginning with the pu'ula, the action which is prohibited, meaning the zriya, it begins with the sada, with the object of the action. It doesn't say lo tizmar karmacha, which would have been the normal way of writing it, with the verb and the action first, and then the object of that action second, but rather it says sadcha the karmacha, right? Sadcha lo tizra and karmacha lo tivtzar, and it's reversing the normal sequence. Mm-hmm. So what do we derive from this sadcha lo? Lo means kol melacha shebesadcha. Lo means kol melacha shebekarmacha. By putting the word lo at the beginning, before the verb, by putting the word lo right after the object, which is the sadeh or the kerem, the Torah means to tell us that even Nikush, Idur, and Kisuach are prohibited in Shvius. Had the Torah said the Pa'ula and begun with Lo Tizmar or Lo Tizra, we would not have included these other types and forms of Pa'ulos. But by shifting the emphasis to the object, it tells you that anything that you do to the object, whether it's the Av or the Tolda, is prohibited. So again, we're only halfway through the Brisa, but we already have a contradiction to Rava. Rava is assuming that according to the Rabbanon, the Torah did not prohibit Toldos. But here you see clearly this whole list of Toldos, which are derived from Psukim in the Torah. The Brisa continues. Minayin she'ein mekarsim v'ein mezardin v'ein mefazgim v'ilon. Now, we have here three Pa'ulos. We have Kirsum, and we have Zradun, and we have Pisuk. So let's go through them one by one. Kirsum is when you cut down those branches of a tree that are dry. So cutting down the dry branches of a tree is Meleches Mekarse, or Kirsum. What's Zirud? That means that he cuts off branches of the tree, but it doesn't matter whether they're dry branches or moist branches. He thinks that there are too many branches on the tree, and that exploits the tree and depletes it. What's Pisug? Pisug means that he puts something to strengthen the tree. Let's say you have a sapling, which is young, and it's kind of moving around. You need to secure it. So what you do is you put it near a fully grown tree, and that protects the young sapling. How do we know that this is all prohibited on Shvius? After all, none of these cases is an Av. In fact, I would suggest that all three cases told us of Zorea. So how do we know that all these told us are Asur? Talmud Lomer Sadcha Lo Karmacha Lo Kol Malacha Shebesadcha Lo Kol Malacha Shebekarmach. Again, as we said before, the Torah doesn't say Lo Tizra Sadcha or Lo Tizmar Karmacha, and that's meant to teach us that the malacha that the Torah prohibited, Besadcha or Bekarmacha, is Kol Malacha. Any malacha, meaning even Kirsum and Zirud and Pisug are Asur b'Shvius. So this Brisa seems like a glaring, open and shut contradiction to Rava. Because if you recall, Rava was of the opinion that the Torah did not prohibit Toldos on Shvius. And therefore, according to Rava, for sure, all these Pa'ulos, like Kirsum and Zirud and Pisug, they would all be mutar on Shvius according to Rava. But the Brisa clearly derives these three as doraisas, and all based on the drush of Tzadcha Lo, Karmacha Lo. The Brisa continues. Minayin she'ein mizablin, v'ein mefarkin, v'ein ma'abkin, v'ein ma'ashnin, v'ilon. And here we have a list of 4 different Pa'ulos. We have Zibul. Zibul, of course, means to put Zevel, which is fertilizer, on the roots of the tree. Then we have something called Piruk, which means to remove stones from the roots of the tree, right? Stones roll on to the roots of the tree, and they, once again, they impede the process of growth, so we should be able to remove these stones. And yet they're also on Shvius. Both Zibul and Piruk is prohibited on Shvius. Then we get something called Ibuk. Ibuk means that he covers the roots of the tree with avak, with dust, with dirt. And lastly, but not least, we have Ishun. What is Ishun? That underneath the tree, he burns a fire, and that's going to get rid of the toloim. You know, ilanos are very subject and vulnerable to the attack of various bugs and and worms and so forth and so on. So by heating up this fire underneath the Elon, he's going to force the toloim to pack out. So now the question is, how do we know that all these pu'ulos are prohibited? Zibul and Piruk and Ma'abkin and Ishun, all of these are prohibited. Talmud Lomar, Sod Chalo, Kam Chalo, Kol Malacha Shebesod Chalo, Kol Malacha Shebekar Chalo. And that's going to include even Zibul and Piruk and Ibuk and Ishun, all of which are usher on Shvius. And this is against Rav, as we said, who maintains that there's no Iser of Toldus on Shvius. The Brisa now continues. So all the malachas in the Sadeh and in the Kerem are all prohibited in Shvius. Yachol, I might think that even lo yikashkesh tachas hazesim v'lo ya'ader tachas hagfanim, I would think that you're not allowed to dig underneath the olive tree in order to soften the karka, and you're not allowed to take a shovel and dig underneath the geffen, underneath the vines, and lo yamali nekoyim. Right, there are cracks in the field, in the ground itself. And we're not permitted to fill in those gaps, those crevices. The mayim, those cracks and crevices would be excellent for storing water for the irrigation process. And we might think that this is also a tolda of Zorea and should be included in the Iser Shvius. Lo yasa ugios lagafanim. He should not dig underneath the vineyards in order to pour water in there. Talmud Lomar, Sadchalo Tizra, Zriya Bechlal Hoisa. Right, the Torah says, B'shana Shviya Shabbos Shabbos and Lashem Yel Oretz Shabbos Hashem, which seems to include all malachas karka. They're all prohibited, and Zriya is included in the list. The Lama Yatzas, why did the Torah have to mention Sadchalo Tizra? Once having said Shabbos on Yela Aretz Shabbos Lashem, which is an all-inclusive Easter vis-a-vis all the Malachas Karka, they're all prohibited. So why did the Torah have to specify Zriya? And the answer is Kedei lahakish elev v'lo malachim. This is a famous hekesh. Ma Zriya miuchedes she'avoda shebesodav shebekerem. This is an avoda that's common grounds to both a field and a vineyard. Af kol she'avoda shebesodav shebekerem is asura b'shvius. So he says that avodos which are not performed both in the Sada and in the Kerem, they are permitted during Shvius, because of this Hekesh that you need avoda that's done both in the field and in the Kerem. Af kolshi avoda shebesadev shebekerem, any kind of avoda on Shvius is also. Aval avoda she'ein nasos gam besadev gam bekerem, if they're not common to both the Sada and the Kerem, for example, Kishkus, Idur, and Milui Mayim Binikoyim, Asias Ugios Ligafanim, all these avodos are specifically earmarked for either a Sada or for the Kerem, but they're not common to both Sada and Kerem. And therefore they're mutaros b'shvius. Anyway, what do we see from this long brisa that we studied? From a pasuk, we're going to derive that all malachas of Sada and Kerem are prohibited on shvius. And that's against Rava, who says that only Zemira and Bitzira that was singled out explicitly, and these told us are asuros b'shvius. We don't have the general principle. And again, let's go back to Rava. Rava says that only the exceptional cases of Zmira and Bitsira are told us that we're prohibited on Shvius, whereas the Brisa says that we're going to derive from a pasuk that all malachas of Sada and Kerem are prohibited by the Torah during Shvius. And the Gemara answers, Midrabanan ukra smachta bi'alma. The Torah never prohibited toldos on Shvius. The Brisa lists all these different malachos that are prohibited. That's all midrabanan. The Brisa quotes the pasuk Sodcha lo, Karmacha lo. So that's not a source for malachos elu asuros. This is just an asmachta b'alma. Chachamim were masmich their dinim very often to a pasuk. So now the Gemara raises the following objection to this last answer. We said that we can answer the question, the objection from the Brisa on Rava, that the malachos that are listed in the Brisa as asuros are only v'drabanan. And that's because of Rava's principle that told us are not included in the Isur Shvius on a Deraisa level. Now, the malachos that we learned about in this Brisa, which are mutaros, like, for example, kishkus, kiskus, and these are mutar even midrabanan. Once you attribute the statement of malachos mutaros, like kishkush, these are the malachos that are listed in the Brisa that are mutaros, and here the Rabbanan themselves were matir. So the Gemara says, "V'kishkush v'shvius mishari, v'aksiv v'ashvius tishmetenu netashta." Tishmetena mila kashkes, unetashta mila sakel. So the Gemara now is reconciling the Brisa with Rav. The malachos that we learned were in the Brisa were prohibited. That's only the Rabban. And the malachos that are listed in the Brisa that are mutaros, like the case of kishkush, they're even mutar Rabban. So the Gemara asks, "Vakishkush b'shvius mishari v'ksiv v'shvius tishbetena nishtashta." Tishbetena is mila kashkesh. Unitashta is mila saka. So we see clearly that it's also to be mekashkesh b'shvius, and they will only matter it for a very special pressing need. And this is a cash on what we answered before the Brisa. We said that it's only an Isa D'Rabbanan, because now it comes to the conclusion, the way we're interpreting the Brisa and the Gemara is Kishkush is not even Asa D'Rabbanan. So now the Gemara is going to differentiate between two different categories of Kishkush. Omar of Ukva Bar Chama Trey Kishkushe have. There are two different classifications of Kishkush. Chad Avruye Lone, v'chad Stume Pile. So what's the difference between Avruye and Stume? Two different types of Kishkush. So we'll start with Avruye. Avruye means that you make holes in the ground on top of the roots of the tree, and you shake around the moisture, and it goes through these nikavim in the afar, these holes in the ground, if you will. And this kishkush is moel lashpiach hasailon. It's very, it's almost like a therapy for the tree. And then we had stume pile. What's stume pile? A different kind of kishkush. And this one is done in order to close up those crevices in the ground, because if the crevices in the ground, then the roots of the tree get exposed. And that's very bad for the productivity of the tree. So here's the difference. Avruye Elon, that's a kiskus for the purpose of drilling holes in the offer on top of the roots of the tree also. Because that's being done for the express purpose of being mashbiach es ha'ilon. Anything that's mashbiach is called an avoda, and it's prohibited. But then we have stume pile. And we said before that stume pile is a kind of kiskus that's the purpose of which is to fill in the gumos. Like if you have a cavity, fill it in with a filling. And although we said that Avruye Elon is also because it was done l'shashbiach esa Elon, in the case of stume pile, shari, but for a whole different reason. Why is it mutter? Shezu melacha nases rak kedei l'kayim esa Elon tlo yomis. It's there. It's being implemented to preserve the tree. But not to increase the productivity of the tree and its value on the market. Stume pile is mutter on shvius, because it's only kidei l'kayim es ha'ilon, to save the elon from withering away and dying. Now we had a brisa before that kiskus is not osur even midrabanan. If you have a kiskus, it's nasa listume pile. That's mutter. Even lechatchila, it's not even osir mirabana. Either Brisa said the kiskus is osur. That's kiskus li avruye ilana, which is prohibited on Shvius. Itmar. Hachoresh b'Shvius, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, Chad Omar, Loke, Chad Omar, Eno Loke. Well, let's just think why Rabbi Yochanan, well, we don't know who holds what, but why one man the Amr says Loke, and this is typical of a violation of a lav with the two witnesses that testify in Bezdin, and you get Malchus, 39 Malchus. And when it says here that Chad Omar Eino Loka, does it mean that it's also minat Torah, but you're just parted from Malchus? Or does it mean it's mutter minat Torah? Lema b'deravi Ovin Omer Rabbi La Kamifli. The machlokes really emanates from the principle of Rabbi Ovin. The Omer Rabbi Ovin Omer Rabbi La Kol Mokom Shenemar Klal B'Yesei Uprat B'Lotase Ein Donin Oso B'Klal Uprat Uklal. So when the Torah uses a language of a klal, and afterwards it writes a prat, and afterwards it goes back with a third pasuk, which is a klal, so that's called klal, prat, uklal. So the rule is that the last klal has to add something that's called a ribui, and it comes to add anything that's similar to the prat, and therefore has the same halachic status as the prat. However, says Rav Hila, that method of deriving halacha from a klal, prat, uklal, that's only if the klal and the prat are both written with regard to the mitzvah say, or alternatively the mitzvah lo sase. However, if the klal is in the essay and the prat is in the lo sase, then that takes it out of the rule of klal, prat, uklal. If the first pasuk, which is written as a klal, is written by the mitzvah say, the pasuk that's a prat is written by a lotase, and we'll soon see the example, is ein donim oso b'klal prat uklal. But rather, we treat it like a klal and a prat, because it's different than your classic cases of klal, prat, uklal, where normally we say ein b'chlal el masha b'prat. Instead of saying anything that's similar to the prat, that's your classic klal, prat, uklal. The last klal comes to the marbe, anything that's similar to the prat. But here in this case, where the klal is with an essay and the prat is with a lotase, we're not going to say ein b'chlal ela masha b'frat. I'm sorry, we're not going to say that anything that's similar to the prat is included by the klal, but rather we're going to say ein b'chlal ela masha b'prat. We're going to limit it to the prat. We're not going to expand it to things that are dome to the prat. Okay, fine. How does all this tie in to malachos asuros b'shvius? First, we start with a klal by the mitzvah say. The Torah says, "V'shana shvius Shabbos Shabbos and yellow oretz." It just says shvius. It just says Shabbos. This is what we call shvisas haaretz, and that would include all malachos. However, when we get to the lotas, then it says sadcha lo tizra v'karmecha lo tizmar. Et sviach tzircha lo tiksar v'es invein nizirech lo tivtzar. So when it comes to the azhar of the lav, with regard to shvisas haaretz, from zriya and zmira and ktsira and bitzira, the klal is written by the mitzvah say, as we saw before, Peshana Shviya Shabbos Shabbos and Yellow Oretz. The prat is written by the lotas, right? And it says lo tizra and lo tizmar, etc., etc. Is therefore, even if the next part of the pasuk is written as a klal, it says Shna Shabbos on Yellow Oretz, which implies that all malachas are included in this isur. Nevertheless, we do not analyze the psukim and derive halachas thereof through the principle of klal prat u klal, but rather we're going to use klal u prat, ein beklal ela mashe beprat. And that means that the malachas that are prohibited on shvius are only zriya, zmira, ktsira, and bitzira. Those are the only four malachas that are explicitly prohibited. All the other malachas are mutar b'shvius. Now we get back to charisha. Man di'omer loke, according to one man di'omer, if you're charish b'shvius, you get malchus, lesle de Rabbi Oven Rabbi Law. He rejects Rabbi Oven Rabbi Law. Uman di'omer eno loke, according to the other man di'omer who says you don't get malchus for charisha on shvius, islay de Rabbi Oven. Let's work backwards. What does it mean, islay de Rabbi Oven? In the case of a klal of an essay, in a pride of a lotus, so we don't apply the methodology of klal pradu klal, but rather the klal is defined by the prat. Ein b'klal el mashe b'prat. Let's take the case of shvius. We started with the general klal b'shana shvius Shabbat Shabbos and Yel Oretz, which seems to include all malachos. Then we have a prat that says sadcha lo tizra, kamecha lo tizra, sfiach tzircha lo tiksav, esinvei nizrech lo tivtzar. All of these are a prat in the context of the lotus. Even though afterwards it says Shna Shabbos and Yellow Oretz, we're not going to judge it as a klal prat u klal, but rather we're going to say that ein bechlal mashe beprat, and it's only zriya, zmira, ktsira, bitzira are the four malachos that the Torah prohibited on shvius. Other malachos like charisha are not prohibited on shvius min Torah. Hence, choresh b'shvius eino loke. However, going backwards, according to one man di'omar, you do get malchus. And that's called Lesle de Rabbi Ovid. He never accepted the principle of Rabbi Ovid that the klal of essay and the prat of a lotus is not considered klal prat u klal. They are judged, so to speak, as a klal u prat v'ein b'klal l'mashe b'frat. So now, how do we get malchus for charisha? So the Masechet adds the following note. He says, Elahu sover sha'af biofen zehem nidonim b'klal prat uklal. He rejects Rabbi Ovin and he uses klal padu klal. And the last klal, which we said was Shna Shabbos Yela Oretz, is coming to be marba anything similar to the prat. And that's a ribui for additional malachas that are similar to Zriya and Zmira. And they're all prohibited in Shvius. Even Charisha is Asura, and therefore Chorish b'Shvius Loke. So this is all based on the rejection of Rabbi Oven. We're going to apply the principle of klal prat uklal, and the last klal of Sodchol Tizmar is coming to be married by anything that's similar to the prat, and therefore any malachas no suffos shedomos lezriel lezmira asuras b'shvius. And charisha is a malacha that's done in both the sada and the kerem, and therefore it's asura. Hence, hachorish b'shvius loke uman diyomer. But according to the other man, that says you don't get malchus, he accepted Rabbi Oven, and if you accept Rabbi Oven and you suspend the operation of klal padu klal, but rather instead you say ein b'klal l'mashe b'frat, so the prat is going to be Sfiach tzirchlo tixar invein izirechlo tivtzar, is we're not going to judge by the klal, but rather by similarity to the prat. And now the Gemara rejects it. Lo, you're telling me that Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar had a machlokes about klal pratu klal in that case? No. Tkuli alma lesle de Rabbi Ovin Omer Rabbi Lo. Both Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar, they both reject Rabbi Ovin. And what do Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar hold? They maintain that even in a case of klal b'yese and a pratna losase, we apply the principle of klal pratu klal. So now that we've shifted the entire structure in such a way that everybody agrees to Rabbi Ovid, so what is the machlokas then? And the Gemara says, "Man diyomer lokesh shapir." Right, we're going to use klal pratu klal to expand our definition. Malach asur b'shvius and karisha is included, and that's doraisa. Uman diyomer ina loke amalacha michti zmira b'chlal zriya and b'tzira b'chlal k'tzira. L'may hilchasa kasvinu rachmana. Why did the Torah feel compelled to write Zmira and B'tzira that there are asuras b'shvius? The Meimar, the Ahani told us who the Mechayev. I told Achmina lo Mechayev. That's what I wanted to. That's what I wanted to show you. That the Torah specifies these particular toldos, and you're chayiv for those toldos. We said because they're very similar to the omos, but on other toldos you're not chayiv.
Mm-hmm.
Velo, so the Gemara says, are you telling me that there are no other toldos that are suits b'shvius? Vatanya, we have a brayso that says on the pasuk of it, ubasada ubashona shvius Shabbos Shabbos and Yelor Shabbos Hashem sad chalot tizvar karma chalot tizvar. Ainly Ella, I might think from this pasuk that Ella Zerua only Zriya is prohibited in a field or Zimur in a kerem. Minayim le'idur. How do we know that if he digs a hole underneath the karka in order to soften the karka, or lekishkuch? Says that there's another girsa nikush. Ulakisuch, ukisuach. How do we know that these malachas are also prohibited on Shvius? Talmud Lomar, Sodcha lo, Karmacha lo. Doesn't say lo tizra Sodcha or lo tizmar Karmacha, but rather Sodcha lo tizra Karmacha lo tizbar mashma. That Sodcha lo, the Karmacha lo, and we're going to derive from the pasuk lo tasik malacha. Shebesadcha is velo kol malacha shebekarmach. So we see that certainly there are malachas that are prohibited on shvius. Minayin shemekarsim ve'mezardim ve'mefagmin ilon mefaskin ilon. Talmud Lomar Sodcha lo Karmacha lo. It didn't say lo tizrak Sodcha or lo tizmar Karmacha. Is we derive from this kol malacha shebesodcha lo, the kol malacha shebekarmecha lo, and that's why kirsum and zirud and pisuk are prohibited on shvius. So again, minayin she'ein mezablin ve'ein mefarkim ve'mashtim ve'ilon. Zibel, we said that he puts zevel on the roots, and piruk means that he removes the rocks from the roots, and ishud means that he burns a fire so that the toloim will die. Talmud Lomer Sodcha lo, Karmacha lo, Kamalach Shebesodcha lo, Kamalach Shebekarmacha lo. So therefore, even Zibel, piruk, and ishud are also the shvius. The Brisa continues. If so, if all malachas of the sod and the karam are asurus b'shvius, yachol lo yikashkesh tachas hazeisim. Maybe I would think he's not allowed to dig a ditch underneath the olive tree in order to soften the karka. Lo ya'ader tachas hakfanim. He can't dig under the grapevines in order to soften the karka. Lo yamalei nekoyim. He cannot fill in the bekoyim of the sodos b'mayim in order to irrigate the fields. V'lo yaseh ugios lagafanim. He cannot dig these crevices underneath the vineyards in order to put water there. Talmud Lomar Sodcha lo tizra. And now we have the old questions. Ria b'chlal hoisa v'lama yotzos. Why was Ria singled out? The Torah says b'shana shviya Shabbos Shabboson. Meaning all malachas hakarka are asur. So it's Ria certainly included. Lama yotzas. Why did the Torah have to specially single out Zriya? Lahakishe lev v'lomulcha ma Zriya miuchedes she'avoda shebesoda shebekerem afkol she'avoda shebesoda shebekerem asur b'shvius. But avodo she'nasos both in the soda and in the kerem, those are permitted on shvius, and therefore kishkuch and idur and mili mayim in the kayim, and making these ugios legafanim. These are avodos that are not done both in the soda and in the vineyard, and therefore they're mutaris b'shvius. It's enom nasos gam b'soda v'gam b'kerem. So we see from the Brisa that we derive from a pasuk that all malachas that are in both the soda and the kerem are prohibited on shvius. And that's a kash on the Gemara that says that only Zmira and B'tzira are the only two told us that are surus b'shvius. So the Gemara answers that in truth the Torah does not prohibit in shvius told us. Only those that are mentioned explicitly. And when the Brisa lists those malachas that are prohibited, many of them are only midrabanan. And the Kra is asmachta mi'alma. Where the Brisa quotes a pasuk, that's only an asmachta. So here we got up to Daf Gimel Amud Beis.